Welcome to this month's episode of Short Clip Case Studies, brought to you by Natera Performance Solutions.
Hello, my name is Tommy Turner. I'm going to be talking about lessons in velocity-based training in professional rugby union. I spent a few years playing around with velocity-based training, figuring out what worked, what didn't work, to the point where I wrote this article, A Practical Guide to Velocity-Based Training for Maximal Strength, and that appears in Sportsmith. In addition, there's a lot of really good resources out there from a lot of very intelligent people in this area. There's a lot of podcasts, there's books, there's scientific papers, there's practical guides that can give you really in-depth detail on how to actually apply velocity-based training. So I want to try and deliver something a little bit different here and not just repeat that. So I'm going to just take you through the journey that I went on to understand what works in a very practical setting. What sparked my interest in VBT was a couple of papers that just highlighted the relationship between load and velocity and the implications that it has for us in terms of one-round prediction. So that was the first thing I did. I just, from a number of one-rep max trials, I just plotted load and velocity to see what it looked like, and you can see the really strong relationship here. And from this, you can see there's some really important concepts that form the basis of velocity-based training. So the first is the load-velocity relationship itself, and that's just simply put, as the load increases, the velocity decreases. The other important concept is the minimum velocity threshold, and that's the velocity or the speed that is required for a rep to be successful. So regardless of the intensity or the number of reps, that number is pretty much the same. So you can see in this example, a 1 rep max, the minimum velocity threshold is 0.19, and in an 80% load, it's the exact same in the last rep. And just important to note that that's exercise specific, so each exercise has an individual MVT. So with that knowledge, one of the first things I ever tried was just giving players their 80% load and understanding that at that load there's going to be a corresponding velocity that it should move at. So I just looked at this group average, what that number was, and they were instructed to just keep the reps above that speed. So this is the equation of how you've worked that out. It's basically just y equals mx plus c. In this case, we know the x, which is the load. So if we want to know what the speed at 80% is, it's 0.4 in this case. So in doing this, I quickly realized that you can't give an average velocity for a set load. You can see that there's a group average, but some people are well below that and some are well above that. So the actual stimulus was very different for different people. And that's quite logical when you see, the range of different speeds that were obtained 80% in the trials. So that's an important consideration, that there's an individual aspect to all this. The minimum velocity threshold is individual, but also each individual's ability to express speed at certain intensities is individual. In this example here, we've got a group of players and their minimum velocity threshold at 1 rep max, and that varies from 0.1 all the way up to 0.19, group average being 0.14, and you can see in different cohorts the group average velocity at 1 rep max varies quite significantly with strength level and with exercises used. So the lesson here was the importance of individualizing cutoff velocities. In order to do that, you have to have that information collected for each player. This is this individual's y equals mx plus c equation. With that, then I can input the loads I want them to lift, that's the x, and it will give me the y value of what the speed should be. Research has suggested that a 20% drop-off is optimal for maintaining outputs, so that's what this number here corresponds to. It's 80% of this number. So the player for this training session would see the loads they have to lift and the speed they have to keep it above, and they do as many reps as they can above that speed. So in this case, it works really well. It allows for daily fluctuations, and in a sport where other things are going on and there's different demands, not emptying the tank in the gym sometimes is quite important. So this allows for individual fluctuations in preparedness and strength. Another concept I played around with was the idea of using a warm-up load to establish what the working sets would be. In this case, you're flipping the x and the y axis, but still using that y equals mx plus c. So at a given load, we know what the speed is. If we measure the speed of a given load, say 100 kilos, we know from that individual profile what that corresponds to as a percentage of 1 RM. So you can see in this example that can fluctuate. So not every time they lift it's going to be the same. So knowing that information can dictate what loads they may lift in a session. So this is something I tried for a training block. The players would come in, put in their individual, whatever weight they chose to warm up with, and the speed that they hit with that. And that would give that individual the percentage of that weight was of their one rep max. And that then influenced what they lifted later on in the session. So I had a pre-planned target here. This then was the target that would change based on the warm-up. So in this case, Fire 1, 142.5 was the planned target. 146 was the suggested target for based off the warm-up set. So he was actually able to hit 145. And there's some examples of this working really well, some where maybe it didn't work so well, or players may ignore it. It is a bit limited in terms of its accuracy of just one set, but it does give you a bit of a snapshot of how prepared someone is for maybe some planned work. It's difficult in a practical setting with a large group of players, and sometimes you lose some of the quality of actually seeing what they're doing, but in theory it works, and it's just something that maybe works better in smaller numbers. Another concept I played around with, and thankfully it was just with myself and not any players. Just the idea came from looking at some profiles. So in this case, a bench press 1 rep max separated by a couple of months, and you can see an improvement in strength. And there's a pretty uniform change of about 0.1 meter per second between the two trials. And the result is it's a heavier load. So just from this, in my mind, it looked like if you are faster, you're stronger. So can you just work on getting faster and improve your strength? So in this example with a back squat, I had a submaximal load velocity profile here with a predicted max of 200 kilos in the squat. So the theory was that if I could add 0.1 to each load, that would result in a 7% improvement. Squat 215. So the idea was at those loads just try and move the bar for those target speeds. So each week I did this, I recorded it. By week 4 I quit, it wasn't working. It became clear that there needed to be more of an external stimulus of either increased load or increased reps, increased work, whatever it was, but just trying to move it faster wasn't enough of a stimulus to improve. This final intervention I want to share is probably the one that leaves me with the most questions, and it's something that I think might be interesting to look at further. It's definitely something in it, I think. So if you think about back to the very start, we talked about the individual differences in each person's load velocity profile. If you just throw a load of those on the graph, you can see how that looks visually. You get some people who are very shallow, and some that are very steep. And is there the concept of like an optimal load velocity profile? So that slope, I just categorize that with a group of 43 players here. This is the shallow one, this is the steep slope. And what would that mean for performance? So divide that group into 3. The group in the middle to me were the balance group. The group who had that very shallow slope, I wanted to give a training intervention that was more dynamic. And the group that quite steep, the training intervention for them was going to be more of a static, slow strength stimulus that might try and push this heavier aspect of the load velocity profile up. So the dynamic group had lighter loads, band resisted bench press, and a velocity target. So everything was quite light and fast. The balance group had the traditional bench press, no velocity targets, just traditional linear progression in load. The static group had a real focus on reduced range, concentric only bench press, so almost super maximal lifting where they could grind out reps at low velocities and just work on that ability to try and push this the velocity up. Here we have some sample programs for the intervention. This is the balance group with bench press as their main exercise, stepping up the loads to a heavy set towards the end. Similar format for their heavy pull, then a push-pull superset to finish. The static strength group, everything remains the same here, bar their main pressing exercise, which in their case was a concentric only bench press. So the bars on pins, reduce range, and they build up to some pretty heavy loads as they move through the weeks. The dynamic group had similar session, bar their main exercise again in the push, which was in this case a banded explosive bench press. So with the movement velocity being tracked, they had to try and keep over 1 meter per second, which equates to roughly 50% of 1 RM on the bar. So following that training intervention, here are some examples from the 3 different groups. We've got a player who experienced the dynamic training stimulus, and you can see the post marker where the velocity of those lighter loads really was pushed up. With the static intervention, we've got a player here down at the heavier end. The heavier loads is able to push up the velocity at that end. As a result, their expected 1 rep max shot right up. The balance player here, no real change in how that looks, but the interesting thing is their strength has gone up. So quite nice visual guide to this. You've got the pre-measure and you can see the differences there, but in the post-measure, the same 3 players, they look a lot more uniform, and that's possibly something that could be explored further. But what this means for performance and whether there is benefit in chasing what might be deemed an optimal load velocity relationship. All of those examples that I've shared are part of a process of figuring out what works in reality in a team sport environment. So a lot of those examples, while they have merit, don't really have a place for us at the minute. Some of the better examples, like the individualized cutoff velocities, work quite well with individual players who may be injured and out of the main group for a while. But the reality is, velocity-based training with us is very simple and unobtrusive in many ways. So in many ways you come full circle with this. You get really into learning about it, figuring out what works, getting quite complex with it, but you come back to what works and what's simple. And a lot of that is kind of down to what I feel are some of the limitations of velocity-based training and some of the issues I have with it I'm going to share now. The first one, which I don't know if people can relate to, but it's just having difficulties with the technology and the everyday practicality of it. If you have a session set up that relies heavily on the equipment working, and then something doesn't connect, or a battery dies, or a player takes the iPad to change the music, it can fall down around you. So I've learned that the less dependent you are on velocity-based training, sometimes the better, and you can use it as a layer in the background that gives you a bit more objectivity. So another issue I have is aligned to that over-reliance on the technology, and that's looking at an example like this. If you just look at the predictions and get bogged down in that, you maybe don't really see the reality of what's happening. So in this case, just as an example, I've put speeds that are exactly the same in both trials, all bar the first load. So say a player isn't thinking, isn't warmed up right, isn't putting maximal intent into it, and this isn't a true lift, it can really change the estimation. So you can't use the estimations interchangeably with real 1 rep maxes. It's just not realistic. But in this case, if you spent a lot of time, like that previous example of the player who worked dynamically, and they shift this lighter end up, what it actually does is reduce the estimated 1 rep max, which in reality I don't think would happen. So we can't get too absorbed by what a graph or what a number comes up with. The kind of final issue I feel that we have as a community with velocity-based training is that it's just a bit of a misnomer. So I saw this in a Twitter debate, but really liked it. A lot of people think that it means lifting quickly. So a really nice point here, it's possibly the incorrect term rather than the incorrect method. So a nice way to put it, it means programming decisions are predicated on barbell velocity. And that's essentially what velocity-based training is for us in an applied setting. It's like having a speedo in your car. If you didn't have that, you'd still be okay, you can still drive your car, but having it gives you a lot more detail and objectivity and a layer of quantifiable data that can inform decisions. So in an applied setting, that's where velocity-based training for us is really useful. It's there in the background. It might be on the bar, and we're tracking it, keeping an eye on it, making sure movement speeds are where we want them to be. Or in some cases it may be with players we feel are very strong, and we don't want them to actually go really heavy and go deep into the well, so we set them a velocity target that's well above their individual MPT. So there's really subtle ways that we use it, and a lot of the more fun, exciting, sexy things you can do with velocity-based training aren't exactly useful or beneficial in a real world setting. So I just want to finish up with some further thoughts that might be good for discussion. And we think about what makes velocity-based training successful, because it is very successful, and when you use it, it's because I feel there's intent there, and that's not a secret. It's intent that drives improvements in velocity-based training. But I feel that for many athletes, it could be the first time they actually lift with intent. So when you give them that feedback and they're competitive with their peers, you see them just putting an extra level of effort into everything. And where it probably makes a big difference is in warm-up sets. So previously they may just, move their way through a session and they understand the heavy sets where it's at. But I think a lot of the improvements we get in velocity-based training methods are whenever we are in those warm-up sets and the intent is there. So how I like to visualize that is, of course, F equals ma. We're trying to improve the force when we train for strength. So quite often we're biased towards the mass part of it. We try and get the mass bigger. We put more weight in the bar. But what VBT does is probably accentuate the speed and the acceleration element of it. So pushing up that can increase force in the same way that putting more weight in the bar would. And I feel that's where a lot of the benefits come from. And with athletes, if we can teach them to be more intentful and explosive and in their sets, I think that's where we can make a big difference, even if we don't have access to technology. So I think that's a pretty effective overload stimulus when you increase the speed and the intent of the movement. I think that's why we can see the benefits of velocity-based training without actually maybe even measuring it. And just something really important to consider. So a lot of the motives for using VBT are to keep players away from metabolic fatigue, keep them away from failure, trying to keep everything fresh. But when you think about how they actually perform, when they're being fed back with information on the velocity of the movement, we're really driving that neuromuscular fatigue. So it's a very pertinent thought that Eamon Flanagan brought up with me a few years ago, and it's something you have to be aware of and be cautious of. It certainly is a double-edged sword, very beneficial, but there are also drawbacks that we have to be aware of. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate your time, and my contact information is here if anybody's interested in discussing anything further. I'd be happy to correspond. Thank you.